first thing you got to be able to do is get to the serial console. Yes, you can install through the VGA console, but then you've got to reconfigure the serial console through the elilo.conf. You want to be able to get to the serial console remotely, and unless you're in a really secure situation, you don't want to have to hassle going off to a VGA console somewhere to deal with things. So this system is 100 miles away from me, and I have to do everything remotely. First thing I need to do is figure out what my root disk is. I want to make sure that I install on the correct disk. And I also might, before I actually install, I might have an OS already there, and I might want to check to see if I've got a mirrored root or anything like that. I also kind of want to check my network interface MACs. So to be able to have serial numbers and MAC IDs is useful before I start. Then I got to get my serial connection. And then we're going to install SLES, install Foundation, and install Performance Suite. Now the default root is extended 3 right now. It is not XFS. That is an engineering choice. If I'm on Red Hat, it's an extended 4 root. It'll be the default root that manufacturing or engineering is testing and shipping with. The installer has to understand our system. It does. We can install fine. But again, we do have a problem that the vanilla kernel that comes with SLES 11 SP2 can panic. So UV systems can use the SMC to install. We're not covering that in this class. We're supporting SLES from Novell. We're supporting RHEL from Red Hat. And we are supporting CentOS. There are still a lot of issues about Windows on UVs. Windows on UV1 will not be supported. It does not work. I don't know where they are on Windows support on UV2 right now. So I'm not listing that here. The other component that all UV should have is the foundation software. This is going to give us particular device drivers. LSI Util isn't relevant on UV2s anymore. I'll get into that later in the week. Memlog is relevant. PCP is there. There is talk about pulling PCP from the SGI distros and using the release distro, but I don't think that'll work very well. Things get out of sync since we need our UV PMDAs and stuff to get to the UV hub statistics. Oh, lock SG is gone as well. And one of the key drivers and kernel modules you need is called HWPerf. There is a push right now to have Foundation installed on non-UVs as well. It does get loaded on ICE, but it does not get loaded on rackable type products or flat XE clusters. And one of the things they're talking about to be able to get in there is an RPM called SGI-support-tools to be able to get that onto all of our systems. So right now, Foundation is on ICE and UVs, but is not on flat XEs. Then we have optional products. Performance Suite, the main one that our compute servers are using is MPI. We are going to use MPI this week. We call it MPT, Message Passing Toolkit, because we included other things in there besides MPI. For example, we had a SHMEM library that was an old Cray library that got ported into IRIX and then into Linux, primarily for the weather market. We have in MPI something called Perf Boost that will run other types of MPI like HP MPI or Intel MPI and take that binary, intercept the library calls, and call SGI's MPT. If you're in the batch market with PBS Pro, there's a command memac that will give me true memory usage. And we also need something called XPMem. XPMem is for cross-partition, but it is used on ICE. MPT depends upon XPMem, even if I don't have a NUMA-link system. There's also the Accelerate package that has CPU set capability. You don't need Accelerate to do CPU sets, but we've added a couple of packages in a library there. But we do want NUMA tools, and we do want PCP-SGI. That's going to give me UV statistics. Will give me hub statistics. I'll use that later in the week to get to the GRU, the Global Reference Unit. And also with something called Flexible File IO Layering, FFIO. There is a distribution out there called React. I am not dealing with React in this class. If you're dealing with React, we can talk about that on the side. This is for real time, and one of the key things in there is the frame scheduler, and also something called the Linux trace tool is available in there. I do have a module on React, but not a standalone class. There's also something called Unified Parallel C. And for a year or so, we did have a distribution called SLURM, S-L-U-R-M. This was basically a batch scheduler that came out of Livermore Labs. SLURM stood for Simple Linux Utility Resource Manager. It was basically a PBS Pro, Torque type of product, but it was all from vanilla, whereas PBS Pro and Torque were based upon Open PBS. So there was a SLURM RPM or SLURM ISO for a while, but they have dropped support of that. Also, we are going to be using the XVM ISO. We're not installing the entire ISSP ISO. If somebody did want to do that, I can arrange that. But right now, the next version of ISSP has not been released yet. So I would be doing a pre-release of it. So those are the products that we're going to be working with. I got to decide my install choices. If I have an SMN with SMC installed on it, I probably have my repository on the SMN. And it is a YUM repository, even though you might be using Zypper. Zypper can understand YUM repositories. Even on ICE, when we're using SLES, it's still a YUM repository. If I need to do updates, we update the repository on the SMN. You could also be installing from the DVD. Now, if you're installing it from a DVD for Red Hat, there are going to be problems there. It doesn't know how to read the disk right. I'm not covering Red Hat in this class. But if you are installing a Red Hat from DVD, talk to me. We can install from the network, and I am going to be installing using NFS. Also, we could have ISO images. So at some point for Performance Suite and Foundation, we're going to install those from an ISO image. Then your installer choices. Primarily, I am going to do an ASCII Ncurses version with UVCon to get the serial console. I do it this way as my lowest level of installation. Yes, I could get a graphical through SSH, but you don't always have that ability. I might not have X11 on my workstation, for example. I could also install through VNC. I could even use a Java-enabled browser. But in this class, my intent is survival skills, and survival skills to me means installing through the ASCII interface. This also deals with, again, non-Unix systems like I'm working from Windows. It deals with long distance, so I don't have to be running SSH across the Pacific or something. And I don't have to worry about firewalls. Now, you could be installing graphical through the VGA console. That could introduce problems because the serial console will not be configured. You're going to need to, if you do that, you're going to need to put into the elilo.conf a console equals TTY-S0, and then the baud rate or something. And baud rates will change depending upon what your BMC and CMC and console connection is configured as. All are basically still YAS screens, but because I'm remote, I usually use the ASCII Ncurse's version of the installer. So decide on your installation method. We have no choice here. We're going to do a Pixie installation, and then we're going to use ISOs for the Performance Suite and SGI software. I want to know my MAC addresses. I need to know that to make sure that I'm getting the right MAC address to the proper subnet to be able to get to a Pixie installation server. By the way, some sites will clone a root, and then the MACs aren't right for that next route. They have different MACs. I need to talk about that tomorrow. Also, you have to be aware that NICs that are on the PCI bus might get initialized before those that are on the base I/O. There's no guarantee that ETH0 is going to be the network interface that goes off to your Pixie installation server. You got to watch for that. I also want to make sure I choose in the proper root disk. So I want to know its serial number, its ID, its device ID. Multiple IRU disks can cause root to be a different number. So if I have 4 base IOs and I come up as a single system, my first base IO might actually be SDD instead of SDA. There's no guarantee on the numbering scheme of these disks when they come up. For that reason, we usually install by label or by ID. You may want SUSE on SDA and maybe Red Hat on SDB, but don't trust the A's and B's. Watch your serial number of the device. And I warned you about this. You can't do an MD root or KDump will corrupt it. And there are patches required for you to successfully KDump on a UV2. Going through that with a site right now, getting their system up to speed. This all changed since Christmas, where they went into a PCI riser card that was SAS with an LSI chip on it instead of the Intel chip. And then we have an LSI software to control and monitor that firmware mirrored root. And I'm trying to make sure that they can get KDump successfully. So we're going to connect to the CMC from the SMN, or in my case, just from my DMZ server. Using Xterm, or in my case, PuTTY, but really we want a UTF-8 ANSI format. Oh, why do I have this? Somebody else made this change. Enlarging the screen can often create problems in refreshing that thing. So I generally discourage increasing the size of my PuTTY. If I increase my font, I can increase the size without actually having to deal with a screen size change. But when I am in YAST and I have a garbage screen, a Control-L will repaint my screen. So this is where I was trying to do a power status, and that was failing for me. So I need to do a power status with the partition that I'm on. And then power reset, and then grab the console. So here, I've logged into the CMC, I did a power reset, and then I did a UVCon to the partition number, not to the host name. Now, it's going to take a minute or two for anything to happen. But at some point, we're going to start seeing our console connection. I want to demonstrate this in a few minutes. So here, actually, we were preloaded, and then we got the reset coming in on the serial console. Then it may take a minute for this to come up, but now we see the console has been connected and created. Now, it is possible before you do that, you can do a UVCon to your R1I1B0, for example, and watch the BIOS on the blade booting. So you'll able to actually see the BIOS come in from the reset before you get the console connection. And let me demonstrate that when we get to that. So after we get the console connection, it does a test of memory, and then it comes up with this hit space for the boot menu. You've got to hit the space bar, or it's just going to boot from the prior root. So hitting the space bar drops me into EFI. Now, if you know EFI from Itanium days, this is still similar, but it is not the same. They've now merged BIOS and EFI. You actually, like your old setup when you're bringing up Windows, there are BIOS screens within this EFI. So I want to down arrow to the boot manager. If down arrow isn't working, I have had times where Xterm is better than GNOME terminal. So there are times where I have to break out and reconnect. In this case, I'm using PuTTY, and I usually don't have a problem. If I drop the device manager, that's your BIOS. If I drop the device manager, I can set my BIOS clock. I can turn hyperthreads off. There are a variety of things that can be done at the BIOS level. And tomorrow we'll get into the boot maintenance manager. So I'm just going to drop into the boot manager, and then I've got all these boot options. I want to drop down and down arrow to EFI network. And again, if your down arrow isn't working, your terminal doesn't understand it. And you might try getting out and avoiding Xterm, for example, or just trying to reset your terminal. If I am on a SMN with SMC running, then I want to boot off of Network 1. And your systems might have Network 1 higher in the list than Network, because the last class on these UVs, I believe, was a SMN class, SMC class. So we want to down arrow to the EFI network, which is ETH0, and then it's going to start Pixie booting. Kind of missed a screenshot here, but here we see the kernel coming up and loading the installation system. Let me demo this here in a minute. Now, once that installation kernel is loaded, then I'm going to get this screen up, and I want to just hit back, and now I'm going to pick English, and then I'm going to start installation. This is all manual, and then instead of installing from DVD, I'm going to install from network. I don't have DVDs on these systems. You do have the ability of having a DVD on the SMN being seen, but I'm not using that. I'm using Pixie boot. Then we put in the IP address of DMZ server, 192.48.186.79. Then I got to specify where it is. So it's install SLES11-SP2_x86 CD1. And now I'm into installation. So I'm going to agree to the license terms. It's going to do a media check. Normally, I would skip the media check. There is also checking an ISO file, but I would normally not do that. I would not actually do the start check. It can get you into trouble if we're doing a Pixie installation. So skip over that and go on to next. And now I'm into new installation. Personally, I don't like to do add-on products right away. I like to get my installation done as quick as possible. If I have media errors, if I make it too complicated, I might end up starting over. So this lab is going to install just SLES, and then after SLES is installed and rebooted, then we'll install the additional products. But that's personal preference. I also don't find the AutoYast very well at tracking add-on products. Next, virtualization. We're not going to do any virtualization here, so we're just going to say this is a physical, not a virtual OS. And now we're into our main installation settings. And you can't really see it here, but there is a tab button I tab down to and then hit enter, and now I've got all my different installation options. And in fact, I tab I did a right arrow or tab to expert, and then tab down to a button down here, and I want to change my partitioning first. I'm going to pick custom partitioning. None of the others will work. They don't know how to create a boot EFI partition. So now I'm into the partitioner. And I want to be sure that I'm installing on the proper drive. If I have fiber channel or other things in there, my root will probably not be SDA. So you have to be careful of it.
Hey, Dave, this is Brian.
Yeah.
What's the main reason why the standard, why don't they create EFI partitions as it comes from Novell?
Yeah, they just don't give you enough flexibility.
Okay.
So we need, anyway, it doesn't really do it very well. And we're always doing an expert partitioner. So in any event, make sure that SDA is the device that you want. There is a serial number available in there, that sort of thing. So I've gone down to SDA, and I can see it over here. These are from the prior class in the prior system. Now I went down to settings, and then I have ability, for example, this default mount is going to be by ID, so FS tab entries will be by serial number of the device, not by label. And my default file system being extended 3. And then we're going to show devices by device name. Then I went back to hard disk and did a plus sign, and these things are visible here. Then I right arrowed, or actually I went down to SDA and hit an enter, and then I got this for just SDA. And these were all the prior partitions. So I tabbed down underneath this bulletin, this menu here, was an expert button. Let's see. Can't really see it in any of these other shots. So if I was on SDA and hit enter, then I'm going to get a per device view, and underneath this button is an expert button. I went to that, and it's going to clobber the drive, get rid of its partition table, gets rid of any LVM labels, and whatever was on the drive will be lost. It does not zero out the drive, it just clobbers the file system data. Just clobbers the super block and the makeFS stuff. So now I'm back on SDA with a clean drive with nothing on it. I'm going to tab down to add. And here now I can set my custom size. We're going to set it to 500 megabytes. Now on Red Hat, you're limited to 256 meg. So if I were trying to do a dual boot, I might want to keep that at 256 meg. And then I'm going to make this a formatted drive as a FAT, and I'm going to mount it as boot EFI. Then go to finish. The second partition that I'm doing here is for root, so I'm making that one 100 gig. I only have like 160 gig drives here. And this one I'm making extended 3 and mounting it as root. Note I'm also formatting. Otherwise I'm going to end up with the prior root. And I also tabbed into some of the, let me go up here for a second. I tabbed into some of the options here. So now I can see volume label, how the journal is going to be done, some of the other attributes. In fact, I've labeled this thing as root_A, just as an example. But everything by default was going to be by device ID, not by label. So here's my swap device next for 10 gig. Set it up, formatted it as swap, and mounted it as swap. And then the last space, I'm trying to do this the way manufacturing ships. Manufacturing ships with another partition called Data 1, and I just took whatever disk space was left over. Now, I got to warn you about something. K-dump. My memories are getting huge. I have a site right now that has a kernel that is over 100 gig. If they want to dump that system when they've got a 100 gig slab, it goes to root, and they need their root to be bigger than 100 gig. I've been trying to bring this up with manufacturing and other people that instead of having that Data 1 partition, we might be safer to have a huge root in case we need to take a big dump. I don't want to sit there with and I've seen 200 gig kernels there, and then I can't dump it if I have a problem. So you got to watch out for that. Watch how big your slabs get and stuff. And in the slab are all the inodes and metadata. So I have a site right now that XFS dump is pulling in 100 million inodes to dump. And that's creating a 140 gig slab, and they can't dump it because it's not big enough. But also K-dump isn't working yet on their system. They had a couple of patches they had to put into place. And they are running with the newer root that is a LSI PCI card with LSI firmware RAID. And we're just trying to get K-dump to work. But keep in mind, the swap here of 100 gig might not, or I'm sorry, a root of 100 gig might not be big enough to dump to. So I'm just adding in the Data 1 partition because that's the way the factory ships. And in this case, it's still an extended 3 because that's the way the factory is shipping it. And then I mounted it as Data 1. And now I'm able to see all 4 of my partitions. They have an F in front of them saying that they will be formatted. And it's not visible here, but if I did a right arrow, I'd be able to see how they're being mounted at the mount point. So after that, I can do my next once I've got my partition table the way I like. And now it says, warning, the disk label is a GPT, and be sure that you can run a GPT. We can, but here, let's see, change your partitioning. I said no, because I know that my BIOS can handle GPT. The second thing I've done now is gone into software management. Let me back up a couple of slides here. So in expert installation settings, the other one here was software or software management. So I'm just having you do a couple of things here. So here I've gone into patterns. You kind of go up to this button here and then hit enter and you get up arrow to patterns. And then I've asked for the C compilers. So I tab down to patterns and then down arrow to load the C compilers on my first installation. And then it's going to pick up dependencies. And I'm also having you use the software manager to search for an RPM we're going to use called perf. Perf will profile user time and system time. So just as another example of using the installer to get packages that I want, and then did an accept. And these should be in the AutoYAS file that got accepted. Now I'm ready, so I can double check everything that it's going to do. This was the change button that I was talking about that I tabbed down to before. Now I can do an install. By the way, you can tab into this and then use the down arrow to go to the different pieces within this without having to go to this change button. You can do the same thing within this window here. So now I'm ready to install, and I'm comfortable that I'm not going to lose anything, that I'm installing on the proper drive. I'm not going to lose any file systems. Now it's off and installing. This will take about 45 minutes to do the install. After the install is done, it's going to reboot itself in what we call first boot. So first boot's going to come up and prompt me for a root password. I want to use SGI. Now, I have a little note here. If you wanted to do a first boot after install, like maybe you've got a system you've installed, now you're going to ship it to somebody, and you want it to come up like a Windows system, you have to install the YAS2 first boot RPM, touch this run me at boot, and you got to get rid of xorg.conf or it's going to try to use YAS2 and the VGA when it comes up. If you don't get rid of that xorg.conf, it's going to fire up YAS2, and then you've got to be at the VGA to finish it. And then you reboot. That's another way of coming back into first boot. After first boot, we then put in our host name and our domain name. Got to get those. And also we deselect the other two. Tab to next and hit enter. Now I'm on my network settings. This is after first boot. So I'm going to disable the firewall. So I've tabbed down to here and hit this one, and it's already been disabled in this example. For me, it's easier to put up firewalls than take them down. If you're not familiar with the command, IP tables -L shows the firewall rules. So then I have tabbed down to this general network settings and have gone into network interfaces. And now I'm into configuring the network. I want to go from DHCP to static. So I'm at the overview one. I tab down to an edit and watch your MAC address here. Oops, I got it. So I tab to edit, and now I'm on that individual interface, and I've set up my IP address. The workbook will give them to you, but Floyd 1 is a 111, Floyd 2 is a 112, Floyd 3 is a 113. And then when you're putting in host name, listen carefully, listen very carefully. Put in a fully qualified name. If you leave off the .sgi.com, you're going to have problems. It won't have the domain defined. This is where the domain name is actually being defined, is right there. The prior screen, wherever it was, this one, that domain name will not carry forward. So make sure you put a fully qualified host name there. And then your ITSI host will be properly defined. I've also now right-arrowed and set up my, again, this will pick up from the prior screens. I probably want to deselect the host name. There was a bug there where it was giving a 127.0.0.2 to the local host IP address, and that created problems. Then I'm also putting in my DNS, 192.168.176.12, and then the domain. This equipment is in a .sgi.com domain. There's no real subdomain naming convention. And then also, people will forget about this, including me. I've got a right arrow again, tab up to your right arrow again, fill in the gateway, tab down to OK. Then I'm going to test my network interface, and it should actually test and download release notes. And then I'm going to configure later for my activation for updates. I'll take care of that later in the next module. Have to generate a certificate. Just hit the defaults. And then add a user. We're just going to add in guest. A lot of people don't even add a user at this point if they're NIS, for example. Then you see the release notes, go next. Then you got your hardware configuration for it's looking for printers and sound. There has been some issues with the sound driver in UVs where they've been turning the sound drivers off. There was a recent information bulletin that came out on that. And then our installation complete. Note I've got a phone for AutoYast, but you could save time and not select that because we're not going to use AutoYast. Next, to install or update your SGI software, we're going to go into YAST Software Add-on Products. And then there's also some more scripts that come with the distribution to add in the update source, the update.sgi.com. So to install the SGI products, we've gone into add-on products here. And then we're going to do an add. And then we're going to down arrow to the NFS, then go to next. And then we're going to specify 192.168.186.79 as DMZ server, and then we're going to give a path to it. This one is the SDK. Note it's an ISO, and I have ISO image clicked here as well. Got to warn you, the actual MR release of SLES was a GMC3. Don't let that bother you. So when I loaded SDK, it then prompted me for a license agreement. I selected it and went to next. And in here now, I am going to search for GCC Fortran, tab over, hit a space bar, and get a plus sign to select installing that. And now I can see that the SDK has been added here with a path and everything too. Then we're going to do foundation, same way, slightly different path. Note it is SPS 1.6 SLES. That's the stuff that I just showed you. Tick the ISO image. And then this is going to import the SGI PGB key. There will be authentication that you're going to try to ignore. Unless you've got a Supportfolio account already, you could put in your Supportfolio account. But I'm just going to continue and ignore. And eventually, I do have a pattern here for SGI Foundation. And then you can tab over and see what's being installed. This is a little bit old, by the way. ESP is gone. ESP is no longer there. That got pulled last fall. Then we're loading MPI. And you can see everything that got selected with MPI. Then we're loading Accelerate and see what's in the Accelerate RPM or ISO distro. And then we're also loading XVM. Now this is a little bit old. I should have changed this. It's actually going to be a 7.0, not a 6.2. So I did not get a better screenshot here. This is an old screenshot. I'm going to have to replace that screenshot. But the lab manual should be accurate on it. So then we've got XVM. The lock stuff is gone now. So now I've got Foundation, MPI, Accelerate, the SDK, and XVM loaded. So when we're done then, inventory. The first thing really is to check the release level. If I'm Red Hat, by the way, that'll pick up a little bit too much. So nowadays I actually spell out release. Uname-A to check my kernel. We're going to upgrade kernels in the next day. RPM QA, zipper. There's a support analysis module from SLES. DF. By the way, there's also a command called support config from SLES as well. I might do a DF, ifconfig, lspci, and the main one for SGI that will run all these commands is system info gather, and I would do a -A and probably 1V and then a -N, and then that will save my inventory off. This is actually meant for the call center to reduce the number of times I go back to the customer and say, run this command, run that command. So System Info Gather is trying to snapshot all the configuration information at one time. So here I did a cat and can see my SUSE release, my SGI releases, my kernel release. There's also a topology command and a node info command. We'll do that later tomorrow. So here's a System Info Gather. Now this one I did 4 V's, which is more verbose, but that's going to take longer to run. And the -N says it's going to write it into a file, so it's now writing into this file here. Then I did a more on the file. Now one of the things nice, I've changed System Info Gather a little bit from a year ago. I can now, after I've got that file, I can do a grep, quote, up caret, equal space, close the quote. And then I can see all the individual commands that are in that report. So basically I can pull out just the very first, the header for each of the individual commands to see what commands are in the report. Also, the name of the report is going to have whether the A is there or not and how many V's were there. So it gives me the idea of the verbosity of the report, for example. There is a SAM command, which is just going to do a sanity check of all your RPMs to see what Novell supports. And I don't have a sample here. I've kind of missed this, but there is a support config command. That is from Novell. So there is still a start here. You got release notes. You go into mount docs. There's AutoYast information. SMT we'll talk about later. Man pages. And then there is description of ELILO there as well. And then the SLES documentation. So I'm going to do a little demo here, take a break, and then come back and do the setup module. I'm running a little bit behind right now. Hang in there with me for your lunch. If I want to figure out what MAC addresses I have, verify it's my system, do a config, an HWCFG, power cycle my partition, connect to the serial console, drop into EFI, Pixie boot off of it, get into manual installation, configure my root, add some RPMs like compilers, resolve any conflicts and dependencies, configure UV-specific boot parameters. I'm going to leave that out of the list. We'll talk about that later. There are a couple of critical UV parameters. Finish your install from first boot. So it's kind of 45 minutes from the prior shot to the next one. Configure the network interface, know how to get first boot back on, save off your AutoYast file, do an inventory, and then add Novell, add SGI software, and reboot. That's the labs. Any questions right now? So I'm going to log in to Floyd-CMC. I actually want a second window here as well. And I'm actually going to bring up a third window as well. Now this one, I'm going to do a watch BIOS-S. And this is going to tell me what state each of the blades are in as I go through my reboot. So this is a normal state. I've got all my slave blades are in a sleeping handoff And then I've got 4 partitions, each one that is in a booted state. Okay. The second one I'm doing my config-v, and I'm going to do partition 6 or partition 4, which is this blade here. So each of you, you're going to have a base I/O blade of 0, 2, or 4. You're going to pick in the proper blade. I'm going to do a UV con on that particular blade. This is looking at the BIOS output from the blade. I don't really need the leading zeros, but I'm just going to leave it there. So there is that particular BIOS output. So I'm just going to kind of watch those two. Okay, any questions right now? So let me do a power reset on my partition P4. Now if we look over here, we should see that hit. And there we are. We now have a reset coming in on B0 here. And notice I now have a BMC resetting showing up in my BIOS output. This BIOS command is basically taking the IP address that we see and mapping it into a general functionality, whereas this one is going to be the verbosity of everything. So there's my reset coming in. So now this is the very beginning of my BIOS flash, or I should say my BIOS being reset. And now you can see the BIOS coming up. You can see hardware probing. There's it's going to check directory memory, for example, here. Machine register check. You could have hardware errors that are visible on this BIOS. So I did a UV con to the base I/O blade. Notice here it's in uncore init, machine register check, and that's what we have here. Machine register check. See how it's just summarizing this up here. I still don't have it. My power command came up now, UV con on P4. Let me do a -- no cache, -- clear, -- steal on P4. And I'm still waiting for EFI. Okay. So we're getting closer. There's my BIOS coming up. I have nothing visible here yet. So I've got this one that's in a booting master handoff. This is all BIOS output. Still no console. We're waiting for the console to come up. Now, if I had a large system, I would probably time this to know how long after a reset does it take a power cycle to hit, and how long does it take before I get my console. If it's 20 minutes before my console just came up. If it's 20 minutes before I get my console, I don't want to be 18 minutes into it before I find out that there's a problem. So it's a good idea to have a baseline timing reference of this stuff. Time it out. If it's taking an hour, 10 minutes to boot your system, you don't want to be an hour into it before you figure out nothing's happening. Okay, now I'm hitting the space bar. I need to do that to drop into EFI because we're going to do a Pixie installation. Notice what I have here. My blade is sitting there in an ACPI platform. I have one BMC sitting there and 3 that are in the normal booted. So I want a down arrow. If down arrow isn't working, it might be your terminal type. Using GNOME terminal or instead of Xterm or something like that might be the issue. I'm going to go into boot manager. And I don't want any of these. These are all from prior classes. I'll clean them out later. Let me show you later how to clean them up. I'm going to go down to EFI Network. Now, this system had been used in an SMN class, so Network 1 was much higher in the list. We'll change that tomorrow. We'll go into the boot maintenance menu and change the boot order. So I'm down at the EFI Network. I'm going to hit Enter. And I could have actually tailed varlog messages. I'm going to hit a tab key. The tab key, when you see eli.boot, shows all the different stanzas. The top one will be my default. Let me get out of here for a second. Control right bracket Q, exit. And if I do a more on tftpboot/elilo.com, this is the boot parameter file we're looking at, and the default was this first one here. And here's all the boot parameter options that I'm using. The most critical one is this add EFI memmap. That's the most critical one. So when I did a tab key, it's showing me all of these actually labels, all the labels that are here. So I'm going to use the first one, just hit a return. And now it is getting a kernel and a memory resident root or an initRD mini root. Waiting for the initRD to come in. I can actually see the DHCP request coming in from that particular, got MAC addresses and things of that sort. So I now have my kernel booting. Now this is an installation kernel. This is not a production kernel. It is possible that you might get panics on it. If you do, you just got to try again, depending upon how far it got. Waiting for this kernel to come up. Now, once I've got the installation going, we'll take a break. Then we'll come back and do the setup module. So please, everybody, by the end of the day, have at least a new root built. I can fix up anything from that, but I want you to get the root. Waiting for it to load. Yes, we should see coming up. Again, time all this stuff. Hardware discovery can take quite a bit of time. Okay, so now I'm in the installer. I'm going to tab to back, hit OK, start installation. And now I want a down arrow to network. I'm going to stay with NFS. Now I have to figure out my MACs. This is the hard part. They're not showing a MAC address here. So I got to know what my MACs are if I've got more than one interface. But in our case, it's going to be ET80. I do wish that they would put MACs over on the right. That's why it's useful to know which MAC is to the public interface that you, or whatever interface is pointing to an installation server. I'm not going to use DHCP. So let's see, 192. I think the workbook will have you use it, but 192.48.186.114, normal net mask. IP address of the gateway, 192.48.186.1. We really don't need it. And SGI.com is my domain. I believe the workbook the name server, 192.48.176.12. I think the workbook will have you just do it with a DHCP. Now, the IP address of the NFS server, that's where the workbook will pick up again, 192.48.186.79. That's the IP address of DMZ server. And now I've got to specify where I'm going to install from. So it's install SLES 11-SP2 underscore x86, oops, uppercase x86 / CD1. It's got to be basically the mount point. And it looks like it found it and is loading an installation system now. Are we okay? Any questions right now? Got to speak up.
Hey, Dave, this is Brian. I just had a side question again. Do any of the training courses we have show you how to set up a Pixie Boot server? Or
not anymore.
Okay.
We can talk
Googled
about that
for
on
it
the
under
side.
SLES, and I couldn't find anything that was helpful.
Yeah. We used to have a UVSA2 that did cover that, but they basically are doing everything with SMC and don't cover it anymore. But it's a good point. Anyway, it did go off and look for new driver updates. None were found. But let me save your discussion for later. By the way, this is the same way that I would do to get to rescue mode. It's just I wouldn't be doing an installation. I would be doing rescue mode instead. Okay. Now, I do have garbage because I'm using putty. I could tweak my putty to be able to get rid of some of these special characters, but I don't do that. I'm just going to agree to the license terms. And this part, for example, probing hard disk could take a half hour if I had HBAs and RAID devices out there, which would be a good reason to actually do a Power-S to come up as a single blade. Okay, new installation. Going to pick my time zone here. These are central time zone. My clock looks pretty correct. It looks a little bit off. Maybe my clock on the wall is off too. This clock, by the way, is coming out of BIOS. If you need to change a clock at the BIOS level, you'd have to do that dropping into EFI. We'll look at that tomorrow. So now I'm into the installation settings. I'm going to tab down. First of all, I'm going to do a right arrow to expert. And I can add things to the change menu. Instead of change, let me backspace here. I'm in the box, and I can go down and do things here as well. So there, I'm going to hit partitioning. And I'm at custom partitioning. And again, there's a little bit of garbage in here because the way the boxes are being painted. I'm going to go to here, down arrow, and I'm going to hit a plus sign to expand the list of devices. And notice I've got B and C. SDA actually turns out to be a DVD drive. This is, again, why you want to be sure of what you're going to install on. I'm going to go down arrow to SDB, hit enter. Okay. I want to tab to this partitions, go to overview, and here I can confirm which device I'm installing on. So this is the only way I can be sure that I'm installing on the drive that I intended to install on. Okay. So let me go back to partitions with a right arrow. And, oh, this is only a single, something's funny here. I don't like it. Something's going on here. What is SDC? STC looks like the prior root. So I'm not sure. I did not check my serial numbers ahead of time. So let's just see what happens here, okay? So I'm going to install on B and leave that other root that's there. Okay? So I had to make a decision about where I'm going to install from. Let me go back to B. So I'm going to get rid of what's there. And this will basically DD the beginning of the drive. And also get rid of GPT at the end of the drive. So now I want to add, I'm going to get my EFI partition first. So I'm going to go with 256 megabyte. Workbook will have you do 500. Red Hat won't take a 500 megabyte boot partition, so. And this has to be a fact because that's the only thing that EFI understands. And then I'm going to mount it as boot EFI. Let me add in my root. I'm going to do a 100 gigabyte root here. I'm going to keep this as extended 3 and then mount it as root. Then I'm going to add in my swap. I'm just going to go 10 gig and swap. Oops, change that to swap. Yep, that's all good. And then lastly, my last partition, custom size is just taking what's left over on the drive. I'll stick with that. And the workbook and the way factory ships it, that's an extended 3. So I'm going to leave that as an extended 3. But I'm going to mount it as data 1, which is what manufacturing calls it. So now I've got my 4 partitions. It's hard to see because of the Q's and the X's, but see the size, the F saying is formatted. And I'm going to accept that. We're almost ready here. I'm also going to go into software. I'm not going to add in Performance Suite or Foundation on this boot. That's just personal preference. I'm going to tab up to search, hit enter, oops, hit down arrow. I'm sorry, so I had to hit a down arrow and then up arrow to patterns. And then tab down. I wanted to get the compilers here. There they are, space bar to select it, and then tab to accept. And I'm going to do it one more time. And I want to add in perf. And there's my dependencies. And let me double check something here again. Yeah, it is selected. I was surprised that it didn't catch the dependencies the first time through. So, there we are. And I'm ready to start the install. Now at this point, I can still recover what I had before. If I was in Red Hat, as soon as I do my disk partitioning, the prior root is gone. With SLES, Any mistakes I made up to this point, I can correct. I can even back off and not install. Once I hit install, it's going to remake the drive, repartition it, remake FS it, and you've lost things. And now it's starting the installation. I think we should take a 10-minute break. I want to come back and lecture the setup module, and then I'm done with the WebEx portion of the class today. So I got 10 after. Let's come back at about 20 after. I know we're pushing into your lunch possibly. Just hang in there. Okay? So let's come back at 20 after, and then we will do the setup module. Any questions? I'm going to keep the recording going, so mute your phone if you don't want a phone conversation. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay. Installation's still going. I'm going to stop the recorder and move on.